Since the day two people walked on this earth, there has been conflict, an innate trait of mankind. Will we ever learn to live without strife? Probably not. But the lesson in the Suez Crisis is to find common ground until we can forge lasting compromise. At the heart of the conflict was the Suez Canal, connecting Europe's commerce with the East. Built with Egyptian labor on Egypt's land, it profited imperial suzerain Britain and France. To boost Egypt's economy, President Gamal Abdel Nasser turned to the US and the World Bank to finance the Aswan Dam, an essential project to revive agriculture along the Nile. While the US mulled over appeasing Nasser without upsetting Israel, Nasser made the crucial mistake of playing both superpowers. He accepted a Soviet arms deal and formally recognized Red China. For Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, Nasser crossed the Rubicon. The loan was rescinded, and the die was cast. In response, Nasser nationalized the canal, a casus belli for Britain and France. With Israeli help, Anglo-French troops invaded Egypt. Nasser retaliated by blocking the canal, cutting off Western Europe's commerce and oil supplies. What happened next is described similarly by secondary sources. Khrushchev pledged to unleash his rockets if the aggressors did not back down, bringing the Soviets into the fold. Dulles' number one fear. Eisenhower applied economic pressure to Britain by refusing to supply the Allies with oil, instructing Treasury Secretary Humphrey to sell off British bonds to run the sterling into the ground, and blocking Britain's request for a World Bank loan. While the UN applied diplomatic pressure, evoking the Uniting for Peace clause for the first time. Canada's Lester Pearson and UN Secretary General Doug Hammarskjöld set up the UN Emergency Force to establish and maintain global peace. As Britain was cut off from oil and depleted its dollar and gold reserves, Prime Minister Eden had no choice but capitulate, forcing Franco-Israeli withdrawal. This was a plausible explanation all around, but there's a puzzling paradox. No primary sources support some of the U.S. action. Records I obtained from the Census Bureau, Federal Reserve, and Congress exposed the enigma. Humphrey did not short the pound. Nehru did, in solidarity with the non-aligned movement. There was no oil embargo either. Britain did not depend on oil, but it was critical to NATO. This was not the time to sabotage NATO while the Soviets were crushing the Hungarian uprising, reasserting their hegemony. A day before the Anglo-French invasion, Ike activated the top-secret oil lift plan to quietly supply Venezuelan oil to the Allies, innocuously funneling it through the private sector. The details are buried in the Senate committee transcripts from the judiciary's antitrust investigation of the oil companies. So why did Ike posture publicly applying economic threats while quietly holding a safety net for Britain? It was the only way to hold on to the Middle East without running the sterling into the ground. The first part of that goal is plainly identified in declassified NSC reports. The Security Council identified the Middle East as the key to American prosperity, containing the largest reserve of the greatest commodity of all times: oil, what runs through every vein of our modern infrastructure, supplying manufacturing, transportation, or heating homes. While post-war U.S. oil consumption soared, domestic oil reserves declined. Control of the region became paramount.
But I do think that the president was convinced. He had a long-term set of principles, however. He believed that no small war stays small for long. And again, we forgot this idea. You know, what started out as, like 9/11 started out as, a raid in Afghanistan, has turned into a global war in the Middle East. Eisenhower was of the belief that small wars through decision trees, or, you go from small things into big things. And he saw that in World War I and World War II. He was looking at the U.S. as potential conflicts that could go nuclear.
Publicly condemning Britain and France transformed the U.S. from uninvited referee to protector of the Middle East overnight. Dulles and Ike realized what Eden and Molay didn't. The days of gunboat diplomacy were over. Military pressure only incited Arab nationalism. However, there was tremendous economic and foreign policy opportunity in government-assisted private enterprise. Through generous tax credits and laissez-faire on antitrust law, the U.S. incubated powerful oil companies, 5 of the 7 sisters, controlling 85% of oil reserves, accounting for 90% of the world's oil trade through the 60s. This position had to be defended at almost all cost, as Ike admitted in his private correspondence. Unencumbered by imperial traditions, the U.S. learned from precedents in Mexico, Venezuela, and especially Iran, examples of self-determined nations demanding fair deals, and tested this lesson very successfully in Saudi Arabia, cultivating a symbiotic political and economic relationship through private firms that served both nations for a long time. What was the second goal of offering Britain a safety net during the crisis? In reality, the US was in no position to run the sterling into the ground. The UK represented a tenth of world trade, a formidable amount. Losing a major trade partner would affect the global economy. This is 1956, a decade into the Bretton Woods system that designated the dollar as the preeminent currency, the peg to which other currencies were tied. It also required Britain to maintain parity with the dollar, a precarious situation. Half of the free world's reserves were held in dollar, the other half in sterling, requiring a tremendous effort to support parity, while massively exposing the sterling to speculation. With mounting speculative pressure during the Suez Crisis, the Bank of England was forced to deplete its dollar reserves and buy back the sterling India flushed, to defend the sterling's value against the dollar, a move that, in itself, further eroded confidence in the pound. Reserve currencies must be reliable and transferable. Devaluation would have killed its raison d'etre. It was easy to see what would have happened next. As the global market loses confidence in Britain, Britain's importers demand payment in dollar, something Britain no longer had, while the export partners hedge on inflation and delay payment, a vicious cycle driving the reserves below the floor, the essential minimum to keep the economy afloat. The bleak November balance report had to be disclosed on December 4th, which would have obliged the Bank of England to abandon parity, taking down the sterling, then the Commonwealth, bringing the Western world down. A problem Eden overlooked, but Harold Macmillan, Chancellor of the Exchequer, did not. He had to convince the cabinet to withdraw by December 4th, the prerequisite for U.S. aid to save the pound. The sterling's devaluation would have created a financial crisis in the Western world. To avoid precisely that, the Bretton Woods Conference spawned the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, a global framework for economic stability and cooperation. In a carefully choreographed move, after Macmillan compelled British withdrawal, Humphrey, Ike, and the IMF stepped up and approved an unprecedented $2 billion loan to Britain, drawing its full quota past the upper tranche with a companion U.S. loan, sending the clear message to the world: if you owe the IMF $1, the problem is yours. You owe $2 billion, and the problem is ours. The ultimate compromise. When a conflict evokes a global financial crisis, forget military offensive. International cooperation, shared burden, and a political and fiscal modus vivendi are the only way out. Because in order for 2 of us to survive, there has to be compromise.